In 1590, a ship arrived at what was supposed to be the first permanent English colony in America. The crew expected to see smoke rising from chimneys, maybe hear tools striking wood, maybe even children running along the shoreline. Instead, there was nothing. The settlement wasn't destroyed. It hadn't been burned or looted. There was no sign of violence, as if everyone had stepped away at the same time and never returned. More than 100 men, women, and children were gone, and the only thing they left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post. Croatoan, that was it. 3 years earlier, in 1587, 115 settlers had landed on Roanoke Island. This wasn't meant to be another failed expedition or a temporary outpost. England wanted something permanent this time, a foothold, a future. Among the settlers was Governor John White's daughter, Elena Dare. Not long after they arrived, she gave birth to a baby girl, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. At the time, it must have felt symbolic, a sign that this colony was meant to last. However, reality set in quickly. Supplies were thinner than expected. The environment was harsher. Relations with nearby tribes were complicated and at times tense. The colony wasn't self-sufficient yet, and everyone knew it. So the settlers urged John White to return to England for supplies. He hesitated. Leaving meant crossing the Atlantic again, and it meant leaving behind his daughter and his infant granddaughter. But staying without help could doom them all. So he agreed to go, promising he would return as soon as possible. He had no idea he was walking away from the last confirmed moment he would ever see his family. For more stories like this, subscribe. Now here is where history intervenes. England was facing the threat of Spanish invasion. The Spanish Armada sailed in 1588 and ships were redirected for war. White struggled to secure passage back to the New World. Political delays turned into years. By the time he finally managed to return in 1590, 3 years had passed. Virginia Dare would have been 3 years old if she was still alive. As White approached Roanoke Island, something felt wrong. There was no visible smoke, no movement along the shoreline. When he entered the settlement, he found the structures still there, but altered. The houses had been taken apart carefully. Defensive walls had been dismantled methodically. There were no signs of battle, no scattered belongings, no human remains. If this had been an attack, it didn't look like one. And then he saw the carving. The word Croatoan cut into a wooden post. Nearby on a tree, just 3 letters, CRO. There was no additional message, no explanation, no cross. And that missing cross matters. Before White left in 1587, he and the settlers had agreed on something very specific. If they were forced to abandon the colony under danger, they would carve a Maltese cross into a tree as a signal of distress. There was no cross, so at least at first glance, this didn't look like a violent evacuation. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, about 50 miles south. It was also the name of a native tribe that had previously been friendly with the English. Their leader, Manteo, had even traveled to England and built relationships there. So the carving almost reads like a note, "We moved." If that interpretation is correct, then the mystery wasn't across an ocean. It was just down the coast. White immediately wanted to sail to Croatoan and search for the settlers. However, a storm hit, and the crew refused to risk navigating the dangerous Outer Banks again. Therefore, he was forced to return to England without answers. He never came back. From that moment on, there were no more eyewitnesses to what happened to the colony. Going forward, the mystery becomes less dramatic and more unsettling. Over time, archaeologists have uncovered small English artifacts inland and on Hatteras Island, historically associated with Croatoan. Items like pottery fragments, writing tools, even parts of a sword have been discovered. These finds aren't proof of a full relocation. However, they do suggest that at least some movement took place. One possibility is assimilation. If the settlers joined local tribes, they would have gradually adapted. Clothing would change, language would shift. Within a generation or two, their English identity might have faded almost completely. They wouldn't look like a lost colony anymore. They would simply look like part of the region's evolving story. Later English accounts mention native communities with lighter features and oral traditions describing ancestors who once lived among the English. These reports are debated, and none provide definitive confirmation. Still, they hint that the disappearance may not have been violent. Another possibility is fragmentation. The group may have split apart while searching for food or stability. Smaller groups are vulnerable. Disease, starvation, and conflict leave far fewer visible traces than battles do. In that case, the colony's disappearance wouldn't have been sudden. It would have unfolded quietly. There is also speculation about Spanish involvement. Spain saw English settlements as threats during this period. However, no confirmed Spanish records describe an attack on Roanoke, and no mass graves have ever been found. So what remains isn't evidence of catastrophe, it's the absence of it. And strangely, that makes the mystery harder to solve. If you imagine walking through that settlement in 1590, it wouldn't feel like stepping into the aftermath of violence. The shoreline would have been calm, the wooden structures weathered but intact. The dismantled homes would suggest intention rather than chaos. It doesn't feel like a battlefield, it feels like a decision. 115 people appear to have stepped away from the English world. They didn't leave a diary, they didn't leave an explanation, they left a single carved word: Croatoan. Maybe it was a destination, maybe it was a signal meant for someone specific. Or maybe it was the last trace of who they used to be before they blended into something new. The lost colony of Roanoke endures not because of violence, but because of silence. An entire community moved out of recorded history, and we are left standing at the edge of that gap, trying to decide whether they vanished, or whether they simply changed. If you found this valuable, a like helps.